Mac Power Users, episode 561. iPad check-in with Federico Viticci. Hello, everyone. This is David Sparks. I'm here today with Federico Viticci, who I'm about to talk to, but Steven is not here. He had a little surgery, and not a big deal. He's doing fine. Surgery went fine. But he's on his pain meds and he's recovering. And I told him to take the week off. So he's not here today. But you know the old saying, when the cat's away, the mice will play? We're going to talk about iPad all day today. So this is the iPad episode. And I thought, who would be better for this episode than Federico Viticci? Thanks, Federico, for coming in.
Hey, David. Thanks for having me. It's fun to be back here.
Do you have a saying in Italian, like when the mice is away, the cat will play? Is there something like that?
Yes, it's pretty much the same expression, except that the mice are dancing instead of playing in the Italian version. Yes.
You know what? That's more delightful. It's really
dance. They have a little mouse dance when the cat's away.
I'm going to just start saying that. When the cat's away, the mice will dance, and then we'll just go with that.
I don't know why, but they do dance. The Italian version is that they dance.
Yeah. Well, Steven is legendary for his love of the Mac. I like the Mac too, but I also, delight is a word that I always think of with the iPad, because there's just something about using this piece of glass that turns into whatever you want. And Apple has made a bunch of progress the last few years with the release of iPad OS. They are really clicking, in my opinion, with the iPad hardware. And I just wanted to get you in today. We're going to talk about the hardware, the software, some of the friction points you're dealing with, and apps. And we're going to go deep on the iPad today if you're game.
Yeah, I mean, keep an eye on the time, because I can just go on. And so just let me know when you want me to stop, I guess. This is like the absolute favorite topic of mine, I guess. This and maybe Nintendo. So yeah. I'm all up for it. You know me, yeah. I'm up for it, for sure.
And for folks who don't know Federico, he's been on the show before. He is the proprietor of MacStories, which is a very well-known website. I mean, if you had a time machine, would you go back and rename it iPad Stories?
Well, now we have Apple Silicon Macs coming, and maybe I will get one. So yeah. Maybe it's actually coming full circle. Who knows?
I am so excited. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I am so excited about this announcement. There's a thread in the forums about people being disappointed with Apple announcements. I totally could be disappointed with the Silicon announcement because I'm putting so much stock in it. I just can't wait. But your story is very interesting. You were a Mac user, and you had a battle with cancer and found yourself in the hospital a lot. And as I understand it, you were using an iPad mini at the time, and you're like, well, let me just take this with me, as you're probably sitting for chemo and all the other things you were going through. And through that process, you kind of fell in love with the iPad.
Yeah. Basically, that's exactly what happened. That was in 2012. So I was diagnosed in late 2011, and I started my treatments in 2012. And through the course of the year, I started with the iPad mini. I believe it was the first generation iPad mini at the time, because the Retina model launched in 2013, I want to say. But after I realized that basically working from a MacBook was very uncomfortable to do. First of all, because there was no Wi-Fi in the hospital where I was receiving treatments. Yeah. And second, because it was just so unwieldy to manage in bed and the keyboard. And, I had a MacBook Air, so it was fairly lightweight and portable, but it still wasn't as comfortable as an iPad. And I remember switching from the MacBook Air, whenever I held the iPad mini, I thought, well, this is so nice. It's so much better to hold it, and I can switch from landscape to portrait, and it's just a very nice computer to use. And from there, I realized, well, maybe I actually want to try a bigger iPad. And I believe in 2012 was the year when the iPad, the third generation iPad, called at the time the new iPad, the one with the Retina display, came out, and so I started working on that model. And
isn't that the one that lasted like 6 months before they replaced it?
Yes, yeah. Because a few months later the iPad 4 came out, but I didn't upgrade to the iPad 4 because I was pretty happy with the third generation model. And I guess the biggest challenge at the time was that I loved working on the iPad so much because it was perfect. I could use it in bed, and I could pop in a SIM card, and I had a cellular connection. So I could always be in touch with with the MacStories team and use iMessage and, use Twitter and all of that. The problem was that the app ecosystem just wasn't there. In 2012, the idea of working on the iPad and having professional apps on iPad was not even a novelty. Like, very few people were trying to say, I want to use this thing as my only computer. And so the challenge was just finding apps and finding all these workarounds to do like basic things, like I want to publish an article on my WordPress blog. And that was a challenge. Or I want to resize a JPEG and save it as a new image. And that was a challenge. There was no workflow, there was no shortcuts. Everything was new and difficult and very restricted, I guess.
Yeah, I remember when the first iPad came out, I wrote the book for Wiley Press, the iPad at Work book. And I used the iPad like nearly exclusively for the 3 months I was writing that book. And man, that was rough sailing back then. You had to
Mm.
plug your iPad into a Mac to get documents on it. And
Yes.
looking back, I feel like the software on the iPad has always been behind the hardware, because the hardware from day one was great, but like there were so many pipes that just weren't connected on the iPad. And I feel like it kind of got a bad reputation in those first few years as being I hate to say this, the air quote consumption device, that's all it's
Mm.
good for. And I feel like that stain has like held on, even though it's not really justified anymore.
For a lot of people, it has, and to an extent, I think it is justified in certain industries where the application that you need on iPad just doesn't exist. And so, if whether you use Final Cut or some 3D modeling apps, for example, or if you're a screenwriter and you're looking for the iPad version of the program or the application that you're so used to working in on a desktop computer, and it just doesn't exist on iPad OS, then you're led to thinking, well, this is not a work machine. But I also think that reputation has also stuck with the iPad, even though a lot of good progress has been made in a lot of different other industries, from graphic design to photography to text editing. There's lots of different tasks that can now be accomplished on iPad, whether via Apple's own apps or via third-party apps from the App Store. But a lot of users still seem to think this is not a real computer. This is just a tablet where I can browse around in Safari and watch Netflix. And it's kind of sad when you read about it in some tech blogs, for example, some tech publications, where that seems to be still the default assumption. And I think, to an extent, that is always misguided, because it's objectively speaking, lots of progress has been made, especially over the past 5 years since the introduction with the iPad Pro, and arguably starting with iOS 11 and then iPadOS last year. We can see the progress in the software. It's undeniable. But I also think there's still lots of lots of different ways where the iPad can grow, and lots of weird and odd limitations that don't necessarily make sense in 2020. So I do believe, like, sort of as an opening statement of sorts, I do believe we're doing much, much, much better than when I started using the iPad for real 8 years ago. It still isn't perfect, and it's arguable that for some users the iPad still isn't as flexible as a Mac for some types of applications that you may want to run on an iPad. But I also believe that overall, for the vast majority of users, it's a pretty sweet machine at this point. It's a very flexible and friendly and welcoming computing environment.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there are some things that, frankly, the iPad is better at than the Mac, and there's some things that the Mac is better at than the iPad. But the interesting thing on the iPad is that target is moving a lot more than it is on the Mac. The Mac has been around a long time. It's a very mature platform. So they've got a lot of problems solved, but they're not also making as much movement as the iPad is.
I also think it's interesting to consider how over the past decade of iPad. When you think about it, it was introduced in 2010, and there's a clear breaking point right in the middle of the iPad's life cycle in 2015 with the introduction of the iPad Pro. And now we are exactly once again at that point, 5 years after the introduction of the first iPad Pro. What I think is really fascinating is how, until a specific moment in the iPad's history, there was the notion of a Pro iPad just didn't exist. And then from that point forward, the idea of you can be a Pro user and use an iPad as your primary computer of like became an idea that Apple itself was officially promoting with multiple accessories, with the smart keyboard and the Apple Pencil. And then a few months ago, this other sort of acceptance of the idea that people want to use an iPad as a sort of like a laptop with the introduction of the Magic Keyboard and the pointer and the trackpad. So the fact that Apple keeps, in a way, kind of reinventing the role of the iPad by giving it more importance and more desktop-like features, I think it's something really intriguing about the product. It's almost like it's constantly changing and improving, and I believe that the company is trying to find this hybrid model where it's still an iPad, right? It's still a tablet, and you can still hold it in your hands, and it's a single slab of glass, and you can use multi-touch. But at the same time, it can also transform into something that resembles a MacBook without the limitations of a MacBook. You can, you can grab the display and tear it away from the Magic Keyboard, and it's a tablet again. So this constant evolution over the past few years, I think it's what kept me interested in the iPad platform. It's not stagnant. It's constantly evolving into something a little bit different, and I think that's very exciting.
I can't help but feel like there has also been shifting priorities in Apple. I think at some stage early
Mm.
they felt like, okay, that's what we want. Something simple, a big iPhone, a big iPod touch. And I feel like at some point though that shifted to what they're doing now where they're getting more power features. And I would love someday to read a book by the people inside that were dealing with those shifting priorities over the last 10 years. Because I do think they've shifted, but in my opinion, they've shifted for the better as of recently.
Yeah, and especially in the context of how the iPad and how the iPad app ecosystem may be an enabling force for a new generation of desktop apps, right? If you think about the big picture play here, how Apple has been pushing the iPad Pro as the high end model, and how they revised iOS, then iPadOS with multitasking and multi window, these features that were obviously inspired by macOS, but reimagined for iPad, and then drag and drop and things like the pointer and context menus. And how at first we thought, oh well, I guess Apple is just borrowing ideas from macOS and bringing them to iPad. But then later they announced, well, actually, if you're an iPad developer and you did all this work in your apps, now it's easier for you to also bring them to the Mac. And then they also announced, well, turns out the next generation of our desktop computers will also run on the same CPU architecture that we've been using on iPhones and iPads. So in a way, this idea that the iPad is now what's going to make it possible for the Mac to have a stronger and more diverse app ecosystem. I think that's also a very interesting idea. How the iPad, and especially the iPad Pro, isn't just a product, but has been a way for Apple to court certain types of developers and now make a strong case in favor of why don't you also bring your app to the Mac now that you've done all this work on iPad. So I think we're gearing up for a really interesting end of 2020 especially in the context of what's the relationship between the iPad Pro, the Mac Catalyst technology, and Apple Silicon Macs, because we also shouldn't forget how you will be able on an Apple Silicon Mac to run an iPad app unmodified, even if the developer doesn't want to optimize using Catalyst. You can just download an iPad app from the iPad App Store and use it on an Apple Silicon Mac. And if you're a developer and you've done the work and you support drag and drop and multi-window and context menus and all those kinds of features, your app, even though it'll be emulated on a Mac, it won't look so out of place as, say, an iPhone app, right? So the idea that the iPad isn't just a computer in itself, I mean, it is, sure, but it's also a strategy for revitalizing the Mac ecosystem. But that I think is also very fascinating.
Now, have you played with Big Sur at all?
Yes, very briefly, but I have. And um,
What was your impression of all the spacing and like the menu bar and
it,
the icons?
you would think that they must be thinking about the potential of what if we added touch input to macOS, right?
I feel like they're adding touch. I mean, it's shocking to me.
Mm,
Like my laptop, I had Big Sur on for a little while, but I had to downgrade it for a bunch of reasons. And looking at the menu bar in Big Sur versus going back to Catalina and seeing everything scrunched together, it's just shocking to me how much space they've added. And I can't believe they would have bothered to do that if they didn't already have a plan. And not to
mm.
mention, if you're going to put an iPad app on my laptop, don't you want to be able to use those touch features? I mean, wouldn't that be great?
Yeah, yeah. I've been going back and forth on this idea of should they do a touch computer that runs macOS, and I think ultimately maybe they should, just to have that added flexibility for users who prefer macOS right to iPadOS, because there are still so many differences between the two operating systems. But they also want the flexibility of touch. I do believe it is it's a very difficult discussion in terms of should they actually just go ahead and merge the two platforms where an iPad can be a Mac and a Mac can be an iPad and it's actually the operating system. I don't think that will happen. I think it's more likely in short term that they will bring touch to the Mac, but I'm not fully convinced. Like I would say I'm about 60-40 on it. Like 60% they're gonna do it, but there's still that part of me that says this is just a trend of more spaced out elements, have a different look. But Apple, they've said many times before they don't want to do a touch computer that runs macOS. But then again, things change, so I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like my calculation is higher than yours. I just think because there's so many normal people out there, people who don't listen to Mac power users, that they're going to see an iPad app on their Mac and they're going to want to use it the exact same way they use it on their iPad. And it's going to be really jarring for them to have to use a mouse with an iPad app. I do
Mm,
think that the touch interface isn't going to be fully integrated. It's going to be kind of like a supplemental interface. Like, Microsoft Word for Mac is not going to work that great with touch because a bunch of stuff in there, you need the precision of a pointer. But I feel like
right.
the iPad apps will work fine. The navigating menus will be fine, but I don't think they're going to go all the way. But this is the exciting part. We're going to find out hopefully within weeks of the show publishing. What about hardware though? I mean, where are you these days? What I know you kind of started your iPad journey on iPad Mini, but what's your main devices now?
So I've literally tried them all, and right now the setup that I've been using for basically the past couple of years is the 12.9-inch iPad Pro as my main work machine. It's the iPad that I take everywhere. It's the Wi-Fi and cellular model with 1 terabyte of storage. I've been using this model on the 2018 version as well as the 2020 version of the iPad Pro, and the cellular version is essential to me because it's a computer that I carry everywhere. So I can keep working on it in 4G. I use it a lot. This is basically the machine that I spend 6, 7, 8 hours a day using. And then I have an iPad Mini. I have the latest version available of the iPad Mini, which Apple refreshed, I guess last year maybe. And this is my media iPad, which I mostly use for reading, essentially, either in Apple Books or in articles that I save for reading later in Reader, the RSS client that also has an excellent read later feature.
Yeah.
And the iPad Mini I keep in my bedroom. This is the that I keep at my desk. I try to keep it charged at all times. And at night, when I want to unwind and read an article or a book, I just grab the iPad mini. I don't keep any work stuff on it. So it's just a media iPad.
This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by 1Password. Head over to onepassword.com/MPU in all caps to get 20% off and protect your online security. 1Password is the password manager that both Steven and I use for all of our online security protection. 1Password is an excellent application made by a loving group of nerds that want to do nothing but protect you from the bad guys on the internet. And there's a lot of them out there. The idea behind 1Password is that you only have to remember your one password. And then 1Password, once you get inside, takes care of the rest for you. It creates strong and unique passwords for each one of your websites and then remembers them for you. It is truly like having your cake and eating it too when it comes to online security. All you have to do is remember that 1Password. 1Password is on all the Apple platforms and more. It's also on Windows and other platforms too. And on the Mac and iOS apps, 1Password takes advantage of all those cool security features that Apple has. For instance, if you have Touch ID on your device, you can unlock 1Password with a Touch ID. It also works with Face ID. And 1Password does so much more than just your passwords. It also is a secure vault that you can store data. Like I put all my medical data in a secure note inside 1Password so it's protected. And they're just always watching your back for you. Most recently, 1Password wrote a post about ghost accounts, and that's where you create an account at some website and forget that you have it. We all do this as we're trying out new web services, and we leave these ghosts behind. The trouble is, even though you may leave that account behind, it's still there and still probably has some of those weak passwords you used years ago. Well, 1Password is watching out for you. With the Watchtower service, it keeps an eye on those accounts and lets you know if there's been any security breaches there so you can go and close your account or change to a better password. There are so many dirty tricks being played by people out there in the world these days, and 1Password is always looking for ways to protect you. One of the ways I use 1Password is when I answer those security questions, when they ask your mom's maiden name or the city you were born in. I use 1Password to generate a random password to answer that question. And then I save that secure data in 1Password. So if I ever need to recover the account, I have a strong and unique password in answer to the security question. Because let's be honest, it's not that hard to figure out where people were born or what their mother's maiden name was. Either way, I've got a family account with 1Password. Me, my wife, and kids all use 1Password and we love it, and I bet you will too. If you want to learn more, head over to onepassword.com/MPU in all caps to get 20% off your account. Thanks a lot, 1Password, for all of your support of the Mac Power Users. I totally get the idea of an iPad mini as kind of a supplemental device. I had one because we had an extra one in the family, but I ended up giving it to my wife because she needed one. But the nice thing about the iPad mini versus something like the Kindle is that it supports all the apps like Instapaper and YouTube. And that can be really nice.
Yeah, it's the advantage of the fact that it's an iPad. Lots of people have said to me, "Why don't you just use an EPUB reader if that's all you want to do?" And the thing is, I still like the fact that I can use Apple Books, that I can open Safari if I want to read something in Safari. Like it's still a computer. It's not limited to just being one type of device. And I just fake my way around it, in terms of not using it for work by not installing apps on it and keeping Do Not Disturb always enabled and keeping it in the bedroom with dark mode always active so that when I grab it, if when I unlock it, I don't, I don't shoot light in front of my girlfriend's face at night.
Sure.
It's just this little these options that you can tweak and keep set to a different setting from your main computer in a way that you can optimize the experience to make it a media iPad. And I've been doing this for the past year. I basically copied this approach from our common friend, John Voorhees, who wrote about his iPad mini experience on MacStories a few months ago, and I totally stole his approach. So he convinced me, and I purchased an iPad mini, and I've been using it that way ever since.
Another thing about the iPad mini that I really like is thumb typing on it is just way easier than on
Yes.
any other iPad.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, I gotta be honest, I'm really I really hope that at some point we get an iPad Pro inspired redesign for the mini. Like my dream device right now is like an iPad mini with the same industrial design of the iPad Pro. So the liquid retina display, no home button, and maybe the same Touch ID sensor found in the latest iPad Air.
Yeah.
That to me is the dream device, like a very basically a very small iPad Pro that is actually an iPad mini. That would
Yeah.
be incredible.
Yeah. With support for the new pencil and,
Hmm.
just that better screen. Yeah. I wonder, you hear rumors about that every once in a while that is in the works, but then you never know if that's going to actually happen. And, I guess we'll find out one day.
Yeah, they've been saying this for a while, maybe as a 2021 product. And I know that I would purchase that product immediately. Like I wouldn't even think about it because it's so nice to hold the iPad mini already, even though I kind of dislike, the old design with the bezels and the home button. And the screen doesn't have promotion, but that's fine. It's just such a nice object to hold and use. You can use it with one hand, and it's super lightweight. And you still have iPadOS, right? So you can still use Safari and Reader, and I keep Twitter on it, even though I shouldn't. It's a very small computer, and people say, why don't you just use an iPhone? And I think even though the iPhone 12 Pro Max is going to be 6.7 inches, and the iPad Mini is something around
7.9,
7 and
I think 7.9.
7.9.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say, well, that's not that big of a difference, but I think it is because the form factor is different, and holding a large iPhone is completely different from holding and using an iPad Mini. So that's why I keep using it.
Yeah. That makes sense. Now, you got a review unit for the iPad Air, right?
Yes.
And we'll definitely link your review in the show notes. But give us your thoughts. I mean, you've probably used this for more than most of the listeners have at this point.
I think it's the new default iPad for most people, and it should be treated as the like you want to buy an iPad, start here, and then you can either decide do you want to have something less or do you want to have more. I think Apple struck a really an ideal balance of the portability of the 11-inch form factor and the fact that this is not an iPad Pro, but it basically feels like the 11-inch iPad Pro. It's when you compare them side by side, the 11-inch iPad Pro and the iPad Air, unless you knew where to look, you would easily confuse the two iPads because the iPad Air it does at a glance it does look exactly like the 11-inch iPad Pro, and that's because it borrows many of the same features, same design, support for the second generation Apple Pencil, support for the Magic Keyboard, the Liquid Retina display. It really does look like an iPad Pro. There's some features that it's lacking, right? So it doesn't have Face ID. It's got Touch ID, which is first on iPhones and iPads. Touch ID in the top button,
Yeah.
and I actually kind of love it. And I will love for that version of Touch ID to come back to the iPhone, especially now that because of the pandemic, Face ID has become a lot less useful because hopefully, we're all wearing masks, and just the option of having Face ID in a button, it's just so nice because it always works.
If they did that, all the case manufacturers would have to figure out a way to carve out the top so you can get your finger on the actual Face ID button.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
they could figure it
Yeah.
out. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure they can. And just generally speaking, I've been really impressed with the iPad Air. The things that it's lacking compared to the Pro. So the ProMotion display, the larger storage options, and the multi-core performance, for example, or the support for LiDAR, for example, which is another new feature in the 2020 iPad Pro. I think arguably those are not essential features for a lot of people, which makes this iPad so compelling as the default option for the average person that goes into an Apple store or these days goes on apple.com and it's looking at the iPad lineup and they think what's the starting point for the iPad family, for like where should I start? And I think the starting point now is the iPad Air. And then if you want more, you can go with the Pro versions. And especially, I think, if you want more from an iPad these days, you should consider the 12.9, right? Because the difference between the iPad Air and the 11-inch iPad Pro is so small at this point. I honestly don't know what the future holds for the 11-inch Pro, because the iPad Air is ticking a lot of the same boxes of the iPad Pro, of the 11-inch iPad Pro for less money. So, or if you don't want an iPad Pro, but you want less than an iPad Air, of course, there's the base model iPad and there's the iPad Mini. But I think my overall thought is that Apple found an ideal balance between base model iPads and iPad Pros in this new default, which is the iPad Air. So I'm actually really impressed by it.
Yeah, every time Apple releases a new hardware device, I get a lot of email from listeners and readers that have tried it out, and there's always people unhappy. And this is one of the unique products where I've received a lot of people reporting in on their iPad Airs, and everybody loves them. I have to wonder, they've raised the bar so much with the iPad Air, is what are they going to do with the next iPad Pro?
Well, you got to think that now that there's this, they raised the baseline, right, for the 11-inch form factor of iPad. And it kind of feels like maybe Apple wanted to give themselves some room for going with an even bigger iPad Pro in the future. I've been asking for, I remember 3 years ago, I was in a briefing, and the idea of like, what else would you want from an iPad Pro? And I've been saying ever since to folks at Apple as well as on my podcasts, I want an even bigger iPad Pro. Like, I would love to have a 15-inch or a 16-inch iPad Pro that could be optimized for desk usage, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, such a large device, it would be optimized for using at a table or on your desk or on your lap. But just like we have a 16-inch MacBook Pro, why shouldn't we have a 16-inch iPad Pro? And I think the fact that the new default iPad, it's not a 9-inch, it's not a 10-inch, it's an 11-inch iPad Air, same physical size as the 11-inch iPad Pro. It kind of feels to me like Apple is saying, this is the new default, and now with the Pro, we can go even bigger because we have this for most people who want an 11-inch tablet. And so that, again, just like I would get a new version of the smallest iPad possible right away, so I would get a new version of a biggest iPad possible right away. I would really love to have an even larger, 15 or 16-inch iPad Pro. Imagine like using apps in split view, right? That would be incredible.
Yeah, the split view game would change entirely with 16 inches. Well, even for content consumption, I'm just kind of thinking it through. Like, that would be kind of awesome to have a screen that big.
Yeah, for games, for watching video, and even the idea like when you think about split view, it's not just about using three apps at the same time, but also if you want to use two apps at the same time, a display of that size, it means that apps will always have their full size layout. They will never revert to the compact size class. So you will always see sidebars, for example. You will always see toolbars instead of auto layout kicking in and saying, well, now that you're in split view, you should use a compact layout, which means tabs, a toolbar at the bottom of the display. Just the idea of the display becoming bigger also means that the software gets a lot more powerful because of the way that multitasking works and auto layout works on iPadOS.
Yeah, I feel like Microsoft doesn't get enough credit for the experimentation they've been doing with hardware.
Mm,
And I went into a Microsoft store back when those were a thing and back when we would go out. And they had, was it the Surface Studio, was an iMac looking computer on an ingenious little hinge
yeah.
that would rotate down to kind of like a drafting table size. And I always thought, wouldn't this be amazing if Apple made an iMac like this? But it never really made sense to me until we heard about the Apple Silicon Macs, because now you could have the thing be a traditional Mac with a keyboard standing up, and you could rotate it down and have this massive drafting table iPad. And this is just wish casting on my part. I mean, I've heard nothing to justify this, but wouldn't that be, how you would immediately buy a small iPad Pro or a big iPad Pro? I would immediately buy that. If they made that, I would be there on day one.
Yeah, yeah. If Apple started selling a table that is actually an iPad as a piece of furniture, I would also get that.
A
Like
dining table.
the idea, yeah, the idea of I just want the biggest possible screen that runs iPad OS with touch. The idea of moving windows and apps and content around on a large display. This is why I love the 12.9-inch iPad Pro so much, because it makes multitasking and split view and drag and drop so comfortable, because you have the it's everything's bigger and everything just feels more manageable than trying and do the same thing on an 11-inch iPad. So yes, I do believe that Microsoft doesn't get enough recognition for what they did. I think the a lot of people in our industry, they applauded the design of the Surface Studio, and I've only ever seen it once, I think, in a store, and it's a beautiful piece of hardware. I think it's really incredible what you can do with that machine. And imagine that as an iPad. Oh my God, that would be that
Yeah.
would be incredible.
A
So
27-inch
yeah,
iPad. I mean,
oh my, yeah, just moving things around like Minority Report style.
yeah.
Moving windows around with, yeah, that would be fantastic.
Yeah.
So I don't think we're gonna get that kind of product anytime soon.
Yeah, not this month at least. Yeah.
Not this month, but I don't think let's start relatively small. A 16-inch iPad Pro, I don't think it's that absurd anymore.
No, I agree. I'm very eager to see Apple's upcoming hardware and the new iPad Pros and the new Silicon Macs. I feel like 2020 has been a pretty rough year for a lot of us, but maybe Apple will give us something nice at the end. Nice and
Mm.
expensive.
Yeah, I mean, and besides the bigger version, I would love to see a different display technology. I believe there was a rumor of I never remember if it's mini LED or micro LED. Anyway, some basically a new version of OLED for tablets. So the idea that the iPad Pro could have the same display technology that powers the iPhone. So with true blacks and deep colors, the iPad Pro is still using LCD as technology, and I would really love to see that instead. Also, something that I don't think it's ever going to happen, but I should mention it because it's one of the many dreams that I have. A matte display option, just like you can get an anti-glare matte version of the Pro Display XDR with the what's it called, the nano display technology.
I totally forget the name of it. I just remember being at WWDC and being lectured about how
Yes,
I'm not allowed to touch it.
yes, yes. I will honestly pay extra for to have that in the iPad Pro. If only because in the summer I'm a beach person. Love going to the beach as much as possible. However, during those times, it usually happens that I have to either write or edit my iOS and iPadOS review. And using an iPad at the beach, let me tell you, it's not fun. Even if you stay under an umbrella and you try to be in the shade as much as possible, the reflections on that screen are just so annoying. And I've tried multiple screen protectors to add a matte finish to the display. I've tried the Paper-like. I've tried another one which I actually really like. It's called the Moshi Eye Visor, which is an anti-glare film that you add on top of the iPad display. And those are pretty good, but they still don't feel like native. You do lose some color quality, for example, and you gain this kind of weird feeling texture on top of the display. So a native, like a built-in matte screen option for the iPad, would also get one right away. I think you pay like $1,000 extra if you
Yeah.
want to get it on the Pro Display XDR, which is an already
Yikes.
a quite expensive display.
Yeah.
And if you want the Nano whatever version, it's $1,000 on top.
Now, I believe I believe it's the Moshi iVisor is the one that it's like almost like a plate that just drops on top of it. It's very easy to apply. And I've been very happy with that. Although I don't know that, that micro texture is going to be available ever for an iPad because you're not allowed to touch it. And the whole idea of the iPad,
Yeah,
is to touch it.
that's the problem. So if they ever come up with a real anti-glare screen, it cannot be the same tech of the Pro Display XDR. So hey, maybe it will not be that expensive then. Who knows?
Yeah, yeah. This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by Text Expander from Smile. Head over to textexpander.com/podcasts and let them know you heard about it at the Mac Power Users to get 20% off your first year. With Text Expander, you can get it right every time. Text Expander makes it easy to give your team the right words for every situation. Whether you need to keep legal happy or delight customers with effective answers, you can rest easy knowing your team has it covered. The latest version of Text Expander even has new and improved statistics reporting for organizations, including the ability to build reports with customizable date ranges for enterprise and individuals so you can track how much time your team saves. If you've got Text Expander in your team, get one of these reports, show it to your boss, and show them how much money you are saving with Text Expander. With Text Expander, you can keep your team consistent, accurate, and current. You can share your text and images with the whole staff to keep them on track. Everyone will share the same message and give the same answers to all customer questions. You can also work faster and smarter. Use Text Expander's powerful shortcuts and abbreviations to streamline and speed up everything you type. With Text Expander, you can create powerful snippets to save you time so that all you type is a short abbreviation and Text Expander does the rest of the typing for you. Keep your whole team communicating efficiently with the consistent language that Text Expander provides. You can even share your snippets of messages, signatures, and descriptions with everyone who works on projects with you. Text Expander is available on the Mac, Windows, Chrome, iPhone, and iPad, and show listeners get 20% off their first year. I use Text Expander on my small team, and we are super happy with it. We get consistent information out to customers when they have questions. When we make changes to the snippets, they auto-populate for everyone, so we don't have to duplicate the work. We love it. Anyway, go to textexpander.com/podcast right now to learn more about Text Expander. Let them know you heard about it at the Mac Power Users and up your team's game with Text Expander. Text Expander was the original sponsor of the Mac Power Users many years ago. We really appreciate it. Go check it out. One thing that's changed since the last time I talked to you is Apple has got serious about third or alternate input devices. We've got these kind of remarkable keyboards they're making now that you can attach to your iPad. It has mouse support and trackpad support. What do you think of that? And has it changed the way you're using your iPad?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Especially with the Magic Keyboard and the system pointer and the native trackpad. I think honestly that has been the biggest change to my iPad setup and the way that I work on iPad since the first iPad Pro. The addition of with the Magic Keyboard and in iPadOS 13.4, the inclusion of a native pointer so that you can use any trackpad or any mouse you want, not just the Magic Keyboard. That has been an incredible enhancement, and it has completely changed the way that I use the iPad Pro. Because before, I used to be a Smart Keyboard Folio user, and I actually had these. I wrote about this before. I had this custom setup for my Smart Keyboard Folio, which I modified myself with some metal kickstands that I added to the Smart Keyboard Folio to enable more viewing angles.
Yeah, I remember looking at pictures of your keyboard, and
yes.
it looked like something out of Star Wars, actually.
Yes.
I know you love Star Wars so much.
It had little metal legs.
Yeah, like a droid was attached or something.
Yes.
But this fixed it for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the thing is, now I can work on the Magic Keyboard and I never have to touch the display, right? Because I have the pointer and the trackpad is just so convenient to use, and the way that it's natively integrated with the UI, with the Apple calls it pointer magnetism. So the idea that the pointer automatically snaps to certain UI elements. It just makes it so convenient to use, and I never touch the display, right? I don't have to raise my hands off the keyboard because the trackpad is right there. But then when I'm done working in keyboard mode, it just the Magic Keyboard makes it so easy to detach an iPad Pro and just use it in your lap if
Yeah,
you want
turn
to
it
use it,
back
or
into an iPad. Yeah.
turn it back into an iPad, turn it back into a tablet. So honestly, the Magic Keyboard, even though I would like it to be more affordable, it's a pricey keyboard, especially for the 12.9-inch version. It really is an incredible product, and it's so much better than the Smart Keyboard Folio. So that accessory has completely changed the game for me for iPad Pro.
We all have these moments, and I think a lot of listeners do too, where something Apple does just delights you so much that it like reinforces your love for using their products. And I remember for me, it was in college, the very first time I used a Mac and opened the control panel, and like they had the tortoise and the hare for mouse click speed, you know. And this is like in 1986, this is a long time ago. But I just was so amazed by how much attention to little details like that in the operating system. And back then, graphical user interfaces were new, but these guys figured it out. And to me, the first time I saw the cursor support on the iPad, I had that same experience of like, yes, of course. I mean, you talked about how it magnetically attaches to buttons and how the cursor changes to form based on what you're doing and where you're at in context to using the device. It's so far superior to the way the Mac mouse works. And it's like, how did it take all these years for someone to figure this out? And in hindsight, it's obvious. I bet in a few years, you're going to see this everywhere. But, you know, it was a moment of delight for me with Apple when they released
Mhm.
that.
Yeah, and I think the idea of how can you use a pointer in an operating system that is optimized and primarily designed for touch. I think that is a similar moment. And if you watch the session that they did at WWDC 2020, I believe it's called Designing for Pointer Interactions. It's a high level design overview of the thought and the craft that went into designing the pointer. Like you might think, well, I mean, it's like a floating circle. What's the big deal about it? And there's actually when you watch the presentation, it's just so fascinating, all the different scenarios that Apple accounted for and all the different implementations of the pointer that you can find in iPad OS. And really, when you think about it, I wrote this in my iOS and iPadOS 14 review uh, a few weeks ago. I do believe that right now, iPadOS is for Apple the most challenging platform to design for, because it's not, you design an iPhone, folks are going to use an iPhone with touch. And you design macOS, and folks are going to be using keyboards and mice and trackpads. But with iPadOS, you need to account for all kinds of inputs being valid options at the same time. And it's not just that you can switch between inputs, right? It's not just the idea of, okay, now I'm sitting down and I'm using a keyboard, and then I switch modes and I get up and I use it as a tablet. No, it's the fact that you can use both modes at the same time. You can use a Magic Keyboard, but you can still touch the display, and you can actually do both at the same time. You can type something on the keyboard and use your finger for drag and drop, for example. So the idea that iPadOS is the only platform right now that out of the box, of course, if you exclude accessibility features, right? But that's a different topic. Out of the box, it's the only platform that needs to support multiple input methods at the same time. This multiplicity of input methods, I think that's what makes it really challenging for Apple to nail down. And arguably, they've been doing a really good job with the new features of iPadOS. So things like pull down menus, things like sidebars and context menus. But some of the existing features that were launched years ago, you look at split view, you look at drag and drop, you look at slide over, and multitasking in general, basically. That's where iPadOS is still struggling, because those features were designed in the previous era when the iPad was still primarily a touch device.
Yeah.
And so this is the real challenge for iPad, for Apple and iPadOS right now. Every feature, every app, every option needs to be designed with that mindset of there's no single input, all inputs are valid.
All right. So now that Apple has opened the gates and we have additional hardware support on the iPad, pencil, keyboards, mice,
Mm,
what do they need to do next? As someone who uses the iPad every day, what's the next third party hardware that we need to see supported on the
mm.
iPad?
Well, I personally, I would love to see proper integration with external displays. The idea, I've always been intrigued with the idea of the iPad as a general purpose computer that you can use in all kinds of scenarios. You can hold it, you can dock it, you can use it with a keyboard, you can draw on it, and you can rotate it. And I think the next obvious thing for it to do is you place it on a desk and you connect it to an external display, and you can use a trackpad and you can use a keyboard, and it becomes like this docked computer that enables you to see the UI and to work with apps on a much bigger display. And right now you can do it, right?
Yeah.
You can do it right now via USB-C. You can plug it into, or using HDMI, you can plug it and you see the iPad UI on an external display. But the problem is this is just a mirroring mode. It's not real external display integration as you would have on a Mac. This is just mirroring what you see on the iPad. And it's got, the pillar boxing with the black bars, and developers can do anything about it, really. So real integration with external displays, that would be really nice.
Yeah. And it's like they're halfway there now. Not only
Yeah.
is it just mirroring, it doesn't even adjust the screen size to fit the monitor. It's just a complete mirror. And in addition to trying to adjust it, so like, wouldn't it be nice, like, for instance, if you could have a keynote presentation that you can see the keynote and have like presenter mode on your iPad while it is pressing out the actual presentation to the screen. Actually, now that I say that, I think they may support that already. But the idea of having something different on that monitor than what's on your iPad would be really great.
Yeah, some apps can do it because there is an external a second screen API for developers to work with. Well, but the problem is they're also very limited if they want to use that API. They can basically just say this content should be displayed on a second screen, but you cannot interact with it. iPadOS lacks the whole concept of, for example, navigating between different displays, which is something that you can do on macOS. You can move the cursor from one display to another, and you can drag windows from one display to another. All of that is missing from iPadOS. Even if you take advantage of the existing API, which, by the way, was designed for games, and then developers adapted to things like presentations, or there's this clever utility, for example, called Shift Screen. And Shift Screen lets you, for example, open documents and browse websites on an external display. But all of that is built upon this workaround of taking advantage of an API that was designed for game developers. What's really missing from iPadOS right now is the notion of an iPad can show its UI across multiple displays. And so I do believe, however, that we are this is more possible now than it is years ago, because a lot of pieces that features that should enable this kind of functionality, they are now in place. So you can create multiple windows, right, in iPadOS for the app that you're using, and you have a
Yeah.
pointer. So the idea of, well, if the iPad is a touch computer, how can you touch an external display? Well, now you don't have to, because the iPad has a pointer. So a lot of different pieces are in place, but obviously, Apple needs to actually do it, and have real, the idea of actually dragging windows around and showing the home screen. All of that still needs to be done.
And also, I feel like there's some possibility that the whole idea of Silicon Mac and touchscreens could also feed into that. What if they made an external monitor that was a touchscreen, and then you could
Mm,
really use your iPad. Boy, I'm talking myself back into the Surface Studio again, aren't I?
yeah.
It's hard not
Seems
to.
like you really should really consider that computer.
I think I'm going to dream about it now. Thanks a lot. I think you're right, though. I do think that that is an area they could expand. It's not necessarily an input mechanism, but it could be if it was a touchscreen. But, it's like I think the next logical step for the iPad is, yeah, I want to carry it around with me. When I get to work, I want to dock it on a computer and use it more like a computer than it is usable now. What do you think? We haven't mentioned in this a discussion of the Apple Pencil. Now it's evolved a lot since the last time you came on the show. They've got the new generation one. They've added Scribble, and I seem to find a lot of people are just not that excited about. I guess it's two categories. There's like 75% of people I talk to about the pencil don't care at all, and 25% of them are crazy about it and they love it. Where do you fit on that?
I don't really use it myself. Uh, I love the pencil as a product. I think it's honestly remarkable what Apple has been able to do with it, and especially with the second generation model and with the low latency that they've been able to achieve via a combination of hardware, obviously with the pencil and the ProMotion display, but also in software, right? With all the predictive APIs that they have in place to speed up the drawing engine and really reduce the latency. I think it's technically remarkable. What they've done for developers with Pencil Kit in iPadOS also really outstanding. Just what developers can do, especially in iPadOS 14, the new Pencil Kit APIs, what you can do with the color picker, what you can do with the access to individual strokes of the Apple Pencil. I think we've seen so many fascinating implementations of pencil integration in third-party apps. They speak for themselves. It's really incredible. My problem, and this is just my personal problem, is that I have no use for it. I prefer to take my notes with a keyboard,
Sure.
and I'm not an artist. I don't draw, I don't sketch. I like using the Apple Pencil occasionally for things like I need to take a screenshot of a website, for example, and it's easier to annotate, draw circles and arrows and put some notes on top of it using a pencil than my finger. But I'm not a regular Apple Pencil user, right? I just don't use it. But I think, especially with the 2018 iPad Pro and the magnetic pairing and charging and the second generation pencil, they have really found and something that works so much better than the first generation model. Even though that one was impressive, but I think with the second generation pencil, they've been able to fix all the shortcomings of the first one, and the performance is incredible. And I've seen so many people do some really amazing works of art with the pencil. I just don't have a use for it myself.
Yeah. Do you use Scribble at all?
Not really, for the same reason why I don't take notes with the pencil.
Yeah.
I just use my keyboard, right? And Scribble was designed for those kinds of people who never want to put the pencil down. And so I wrote about this in my review. All the things that Apple has done to make Scribble work out of the box in iPadOS 14, where your handwriting is automatically turned into typed text for any text field. It's incredible what Apple has done. The fact that if you're a developer, you get this feature for free just by supporting native text fields. And then if you want, you can optimize for Scribble. And you can do things like, for example, in the latest version of Fantastical for iPadOS 14, the app actually detects if you press the plus button to create an event, right? And if it detects that you press that button with the pencil rather than your finger, the text field, the compose field that comes up is bigger
Yeah.
than it would otherwise be, because the app thinks, well, you're using a pencil, so I assume you want to scribble. Therefore, if you want to scribble, I'm going to make the compose field bigger for you. Like, developers can do all these little optimizations in their apps. And I wrote about them and I tested a bunch of them, and then I put the pencil back in my drawer. I think it's totally fine. This is the beauty of iPad, right? You don't have to use all the accessories. You have the freedom to choose. You have the flexibility to choose. But ultimately, you can just pick you can pick accessory that works best for you, or maybe no accessory at all, and you can still use an iPad to its full potential.
It's funny. I find Scribble very useful for small bits of text. Like I manage my calendar and OmniFocus largely on my iPad, in iPad mode. It's not connected to a calendar. And the pencil's a great device for managing the user interface. I use it in lieu of my finger, and I add tasks in OmniFocus. I add calendar events in Fantastical, and I
Mm,
do that with the pencil all the time. But one time I tried to like write a blog post with the pencil, and it just was too slow for me. It just wasn't right for me.
yeah.
I would rather use a keyboard for that. But you're right. It is interesting, this amazing different set of input mechanisms you have, and everybody can kind of pick their own. And that's one of the things that makes the iPad kind of great.
Yeah.
What do you think of the new kind of app design model with the sidebars?
I think it's the right direction for the iPad as a way for developers to optimize their experiences, their apps to take advantage of the iPad's bigger form factor and the different the fact that the majority of people are going to use this device in landscape mode, especially with the iPad Pro, especially if they have a keyboard. And so the idea that the iPad, even though it had some exclusive features compared to iOS, traditional app design was still rooted in the same conventions, in the same UI conventions of designing apps for iPhone, such as using tab bars at the bottom of the screen, for example. And so I think it absolutely makes sense for iPad to say, well, this widescreen display maybe makes more sense to put navigation in a sidebar on the right. And if you start there, then I think it automatically follows that you may want to have a multi-column layout because you have a widescreen form factor, and uh, you have things like pull-down menus, right? That take advantage of the fact that you now have a trackpad and you can do things like right clicks basically in the UI to show a context menu that is attached to a toolbar. So all these things, I think they absolutely make sense for iPadOS in the context of how people actually use an iPad in 2020. And I also think it's fine that these ideas were arguably borrowed from macOS. I see a lot of angst every time Apple announces something, and there's a group of people on Twitter, for example, who are like, "Oh yeah, so the iPad is now like Mac," and I think that's a bit
Yeah.
short-sighted for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think this is the same company that is making multiple platforms. If anything, Apple is stealing from itself, and I think
Yeah.
it's okay to go back to an idea that you figured out 2 decades ago if it's still modern and practical. I don't see anything wrong with that. But also, that isn't necessarily the truth, because what Apple is doing here and what they've been doing for the past few years actually is they may have been inspired by ideas that worked on macOS before. But if you look closely, you'll see how each of those ideas has been reimagined, has been adapted to work on iPad. All of the features that Apple borrowed from macOS in recent memory, from split view to the Files app to drag and drop to context menus and multi-window and search, even in iPadOS 14, all of those features they've been rethought and redesigned because they need to support touch and the pointer and the keyboard and the pencil all at the same time, right? So, in the context of app design, sidebars, for example, you can use with the pointer, obviously, very fast and easy to now navigate different sections of an app. But you can also use touch and you can tap on a sidebar and you can dismiss a sidebar by swiping across the title bar with your finger or with the pointer. It doesn't matter. So the idea that this is a desktop like layout, sure, but it's also ultimately designed for iPadOS. It supports touch, keyboard, and the pointer, and I think that makes it really it makes certain apps a lot more powerful because you still have the same intuitive design, but you also have the faster navigation and all these little tricks that we learned on the desktop years ago. Now we can take advantage of them on iPad.
Yeah, the whole idea of tribalism amongst Apple enthusiasts, just I find so abhorrent. We all love this stuff. And if you look at Apple, how Apple makes its money, they're making gazillions of dollars on all this hardware. And there's people in Apple who want to make each platform special and unique and good, but they borrow from each other because that's how you make them special, unique, and good. It's not a zero sum game. So if we have a Silicon Mac that runs iPad software, it doesn't mean the iPad is going to go away. And just the opposite is true as well. And everybody just calm down. It's okay.
Yeah, yeah. I've been saying this for a while, so I like. I really don't see this taking sides. I think ultimately, and this is a bigger discussion, but I think ultimately, like computers are computers, and the main job of a computer is to empower us to do more than we would otherwise be able to. And so I don't really get the picking sides. Like you want to use Windows, fine. You wanna work on a
Yeah.
Mac, that's fine. Like I don't care as long as you can be productive, as long as you can do your life's work and be save time. The whole point is that we should be using the computer that works best for us so that we can save time and avoid doing boring stuff because the computer does it for us and we have more time to do something else, whether it's play with our
Yeah.
pets or spend time with our family or just go outside. Maybe not right now, but in the future. So yeah, I don't really get the tribalism either. Like I don't get it.
It's just part of this kind of thing, though. I mean, we just did an episode recently on research tools, and I talked about the difference between Obsidian and Roam Research, which are two apps you've probably never heard of because they're not on iPad. But I generally like Obsidian better, and all the Roam people are writing me now saying, "Oh, you don't understand." And no, I really want Roam to be good too. You don't have to write me. I get it. I want them all to be good. I just, for various reasons, I like one over the other. But there's no need. There's no need to get angry. It's
I
okay.
know, I know, I know.
This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by the Intrazone by Microsoft SharePoint, a bi-weekly conversation and interview podcast hosted by the SharePoint team. Discovering new podcasts is always fun, and if you listen to Mac Power Users, you are geek inclined, and a great show you should check out is the Intrazone by Microsoft SharePoint. If you're looking for a new show to listen to, the Intrazone is a bi-weekly podcast with conversations and interviews on how Microsoft SharePoint, OneDrive, and related tech can work for you. You'll hear from guest experts behind the scenes and out in the field so you can see how SharePoint fits into your everyday work life to easily share and manage content, knowledge, and applications. Each show covers a bunch of segments like news and announcements, focus topic of the week, guest perspectives, frequently asked questions of the week, and upcoming events. And just so you have an idea what to expect, I want to tell you about some of the topics you might be interested in that were on previous episodes. They've discussed working from home, which I know is relevant to just about everybody at this point, also figuring out an intelligent intranet for your organization. They also did an episode talking about API and teamwork too, which you should give a try. Just in the last month, there were a few episodes that I found of note. In their SharePoint Roadmap episode, they talked about all of the steps they're taking to improve the Microsoft tools to help organizations get better. They also explained their OneDrive widget for iPhone in that episode, which I found really interesting from a company like Microsoft taking time to come up with its own widget. Microsoft's been great about supporting the iPhone and iPad with their tools, and this conversation reflects that. They also had an episode last month with the Special Olympics of Canada, where they explained how they transitioned the Special Olympics from a Dropbox install to Microsoft tools to make everything better and faster. It was a really great workflow episode, and I enjoyed listening to the whole thing. So go and listen to it now. Just search for the Intrazone wherever you get your podcasts. That's INTRAZONE, or just click the link in the show notes and check it out. Our thanks to the Intrazone by Microsoft SharePoint for their support of the Mac Power Users and all of Relay FM. There's one thing I've been meaning to ask you, and I knew you were going to come on the show, so I didn't want to bug you about it until I could get you on mic. But
Uh-huh.
this thing with widgets and the iPad, on the iPhone, widgets are great. And on the
Yeah,
iPad, they're frustrating, at least
yeah.
for me. So for listeners that aren't aware, if you have an iPad and you have these widgets, you only get them in the left column. And just to set up the problem for Federico to help me solve, not only do you only get one column, you really only get basically two segments of them, or or two, or one medium widget to show up full time without having to scroll to pull up to see it. And I do not understand why the platform with the bigger screen actually has fewer default widgets. What do you think about it? How are you
It's
dealing with
such
it?
a missed opportunity, right? The fact that you cannot place widgets on the home screen on iPad. You would think that if anything, like if you went back in time and you were asked, look, Apple is about to add widgets to the home screen, and you will be able to intermix icons and widgets on the same page of the home screen. What do you think will be the first device where they do it? And I think most people will say, well, duh, they're going to start on the iPad because it's easier, because the screen
Yeah,
is bigger. But no, Apple went the opposite direction, which to an extent, obviously, Apple knows best, right? And you see just how viral widgets went among regular people, millions of people.
yeah,
Maybe they actually knew what they were doing, but still, it does feel like a missed opportunity that on iPad you can, widgets are still confined to this column on the left side. And so it's like I'm not dealing with it in any particular way, except that I picked the four widgets that I want to see at all times. So my task manager and music widgets and my calendar, and I'm just using those, and it's kind of sad because I would love to put more widgets on iPad. I would completely revolutionize my home screen if I could, and I'm just very bummed out about it because I had so many ideas, right? When I was watching the WWDC video, it immediately came to me like, oh, imagine like I could put a shortcut here and I could put my task manager here, like intermix all these icons and widgets. But no,
yeah,
it's still the same system. So I guess we have our obvious wish list item for iPadOS
yeah,
15. So,
yeah.
maybe that's a plus. But yeah, I'm very sad, and I'm not dealing with it in any particular way. There's no hidden trick. It's all just sad.
There's part of me that is hoping that we get like in 14.3
Yeah.
or 14.4.
Mm,
Um, I know, but I mean, when you see what a big deal the widgets have been for the phone and all the marketing Apple got out of it, I could see them wanting to push it up if they could. And I'm sure there's good reasons why, they forked the operating system to iPad OS last year. And maybe there's a reason why they just couldn't do it right now and they ran out of time. But man, I would love
right.
to get that. Every time I look at my iPad with all of those icons on the screen and that sad little widget on the left side, my heart breaks just a little bit.
Yeah.
I thought I was hoping you'd have the answer,
I
Federico, but I
don't.
guess the answer is we have to wait.
I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for you. I know, I know. There's no secret sauce. There's no magic trick. It's just sad. It's sad for everybody.
Yeah. I'd like to talk about what are some of the things the workflows that you've developed on iPad that you just particularly love that make you smile when you run them?
Ah,
And what are some of the things on iPad that kind of frustrate
ah.
you still?
Can I get real nerdy with you about?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, this is the Mac Power Users.
Okay.
Go all the way
Okay. So
down.
there's this particular workflow which I optimize for my long form writing. So my annual iOS reviews as well as longer stories that I do during the year. So I have this setup that involves IA Writer, which is my default, my go-to, like my favorite text editor. Um,
It's a very pretty text
it
editor.
is, and I actually commissioned a couple of years ago custom preview templates, so that when I preview my Markdown in IA Writer, it looks like the MacStories website. So I have this
Nice.
custom preview setup as well. So IA Writer, and it involves three apps: IA Writer, Scriptable, which is the JavaScript app,
Yeah.
um,
Sure.
and Shortcuts, obviously. So one of the features, this gets kind of, as I said, very geeky. So I'll do my best. IA Writer has a feature called content blocks, and a content block is basically a file reference. as you're writing in Markdown, you can type a forward slash and insert a reference to another file. So imagine typing slash photo.jpg, right? You're referencing an external file. And when you hit preview, that external reference turns into an actual image so that in your Markdown preview, you see the photo, right? As if it
Yeah.
were an image URL, but it's not. It's a reference to the file system. Now, to generate these references, I have a script in Scriptable that takes a photo as input and saves it into a subfolder in iCloud Drive. And this subfolder is a folder bookmark. This is like a fancy iOS and iPadOS API that not a lot of file managers and text editors support. I believe actually IA Writer is the only text editor that supports this. Um, but basically, in Scriptable, you can say, hey, ignore the sandbox. Let me create a bookmark to this folder, and I want to save files into these folders, even though it's not part of your document container. So you basically poke a hole into the sandbox, and you say,
Sure.
Scriptable, save stuff into an IA Writer subfolder. And the glue that connects all of these pieces together is of course shortcuts. So when I'm editing my articles, I keep IA Writer on the left and shortcuts on the right in split view, with shortcuts being the smaller window. I have a shortcut
Yeah.
that runs a scriptable action. And basically what happens is I take a screenshot and then I run a shortcut. The shortcut takes the image, passes the image as input to the scriptable action. And now in iPadOS and iOS 14, thanks to this new developer technology called in-app intent handling, Shortcuts doesn't have to launch scriptable anymore. It just happens in the background. And after 2 seconds, that image gets saved again in the background into a subfolder of IA Writer. And in the clipboard, I have a content block. I have a file reference. And I just need to hit paste in my text editor. And I have something like slash image assets, which is the name of the subfolder, slash, I don't know, homescreen.png, which is the screenshot that I just saved. And all of this happens in 2 seconds. Later, when I'm done creating these content blocks, and again, through the whole time, I can just hit preview and I see these images, right? I didn't have to upload them. It took me 2 seconds to save them. At the very end of the process, I have a script that runs through all these content blocks and actually uploads them to my CDN and returns actual
Nice.
live
Nice.
HTTPS links.
Oh
Yeah.
wow. The last part is where you got
Yeah.
me. That's
Yeah.
great. And then so you create the link initially as writing it, but then you don't have to do any extra work on the back end.
Exactly. Like I don't need to wait for the
Yeah.
upload time. I just because I want to insert the screenshots as quickly as possible. Like I want to take them and continue editing, and then later I can just sit back, run the script, and the images go up, and I it's fine because I've already done the work. So this is something that I've been developing for the past 2 years at this point, and it clicked really this summer for a couple of reasons. One is what I mentioned, how shortcuts, developers who want to make shortcuts actions can now take advantage of this new technology in iOS 14 where complex actions can run in the background. You don't have to do the
Yeah.
whole shortcuts is launching this application and then it's coming back. No, it just runs in the background. And second, we finally developed our own backend for uploading and compressing images. And so the script that I use for uploading all those images and compressing them is so much faster than before. So yeah, I'm really happy with this. But really, it's also thanks to IA Writer and the fact that it supports these content blocks. They have a documentation page up on their website somewhere where they explain you can do some pretty wild things with content blocks. Like you can reference, I mentioned JPEG and PNG files, but you can also reference other markdown documents. So you can have Markdown inside Markdown, or you can reference like nobody, for example, ever knows the correct syntax for a multi-markdown table, right? Nobody ever knows how to.
Yeah.
Well, in IA Writer, you can reference an external CSV file, and you can embed that as a table inside your Markdown. It's really wild.
Oh, nice. So you don't have to deal with all the pipes. Yeah.
Nope, nope.
Nice. You know what else you acknowledge there is Simon Stovering, who does
Absolutely. Yes.
Scriptable and Data Jar. That guy is like, he is so
Yeah,
precious to the automation community.
absolutely.
Um, not only is Scriptable an amazing app, basically Scriptable lets you create JavaScript automation where the shortcuts team didn't, so it adds to shortcuts. But data jar, just the idea of an app that holds global variables for shortcuts, is like, it's a game changer. And this one guy just did these things, I think, in his free time.
Yeah, it's incredible when an indie developer is able to build products that enable so many other people, right? And we've been seeing this. We've been fortunate enough in the Apple community, in the Apple ecosystem, to have a few examples of these developers over the years. A few years ago, Ole Zorn with Editorial and Pythonista, and now of course
Yeah.
there's Simon. But I'm also thinking of folks like Silvio Rizzi with Reader, for example, right? Indie developers that do these amazing applications that empower hundreds of thousands of people across the world. I think it's really inspiring, and really, it's one of the reasons why I love writing about these kinds of apps. Still, it really is like watching these folks put together these applications, these utilities. It makes me want to do more myself as well. I find it really inspiring to know and to see somebody do something really useful for lots of other people.
Yeah, and it's funny how this whole ecosystem has grown out of shortcuts, where there's these apps that add to shortcuts and they solve real problems. Like something that I've complained about, I think you even referenced me in one of your reviews a few years ago about how tagging is such a dumpster fire on iPad. It just, tagging files isn't easy. And I vividly remember you and me sitting at that coffee place
Yes.
in San Francisco when that first beta came out, and we realized that the only way you can apply a tag is to scroll through the whole list. And
Yeah.
we were laughing, oh, this is a beta thing. They'll fix that. And that
Uh-huh.
was like 3 or 4 years
Yep.
ago. Still not fixed. But Toolbox Pro is another app. I mean, he
Yep.
came out with a feature to add a tag with a Toolbox Pro action. So you add that to your shortcuts. You can create like a choose from menu, simple shortcut, and tag any file you want with multiple tags or remove tags or append tags, all the tools we want with a simple shortcut action now. And man, that's really been a game changer for a lot of people who are interested in automation on iPad.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really, and I think Apple knows about this, right? Because all the things that they've been doing with shortcuts, especially this year, these power user improvements and these developer improvements, they have been listening to the community. And so they have been doing things like I mentioned, in-app intent handling, but also things like developers can now mark their actions as deprecated. This was something that folks like Simon Stovring have been asking for the past couple of years. And I'm also thinking of people like Anders Borum, for example, the developer of Working Copy and Secure
Yeah.
Shellfish, right? Another excellent utility if you work on iPad and iPad Pro. All these things that Apple has been doing in shortcuts, it shows that they do listen to the community, they do listen to power users. And so, for example, we also got stuff like, which I never thought was gonna be possible, cut and paste, copy and paste for actions in shortcuts. In iOS and iPadOS 14, you can select an action in any of your shortcut and paste it somewhere else, even paste it in a different shortcut. I think that's incredible. Like
which is really useful with things like URL callbacks and these actions that are very detailed
Right.
and hard to
Right.
replicate.
And
Yeah.
yeah, so the I get, and obviously we also got folders. So, you know, it's been interesting to watch the. I think it's fair to call it the shortcuts ecosystem at this point. All these different apps that add functionality to shortcuts in a way that is actually native, because all these actions are just native components of shortcuts. And especially
Yeah.
now that they can just run in line and do stuff in the background, that's incredible.
And I feel like the Shortcuts team has done such a great service for the community this year by not like, I mean, you could see a different version of Apple that stops
Oh yeah.
that, right?
Oh
They're
yes.
like, no, this is our thing. We're going to do it our way. But instead, they actually made it easier for people to plug into Shortcuts and add additional features. And clearly, it's power users that are going to be downloading apps like Toolbox
Right.
Pro and Scriptable. But, so why not just give us the freedom to use those tools how we want? And then let the other users who don't want to go that far down the rabbit hole just be happy with what they have. I think it's great.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, I do think it's the fact that you can still share your shortcuts. I think it's really nice that Apple kept that option, because you have to believe, right, that at some point in the past, following the workflow acquisition, somebody at Apple looked at the idea of sharing code essentially with other people and thought, well, we're getting rid of this, right? You have to believe that that
Yeah.
discussion happened. And the fact
Especially in this age of security conscious
Exactly.
Apple.
But the fact that
Yeah.
Apple, they kept it around, they made it more secure with all the permissions and the untrusted shortcut system and all these things that they've done, with just making it super easy to enable and disable permissions inside of a shortcut. That is so nice of them that they have kept this. They're still working on it. They have removed some options, right, for sure. And but overall, the fact that this is not only the same as before, but so much more powerful than workflow because of native actions and parameters and third-party apps. Were really, it feels like at this point, especially in iOS 14, we are past the days of X callback URL, and we now have real automation and a real exchange of data between apps via shortcuts. And I think the obvious next step, if you ask me, is to bring shortcuts to the Mac. It needs to happen at some point, and I think especially now that we go back to the idea you're going to have iPad apps on the Mac, and you're going to have either like an actual iPad app or a Catalyst version of the iPad app on the Mac. And well, if you did the work of supporting shortcuts on iPad, well, there you go. You now also have shortcuts on the Mac, and the same actions, they work on the Mac just like they work on iPad. This is all, my speculation, but I think it will make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think it's very likely we're going to see shortcuts on the Mac. I'm a little mixed on it though. Like I feel like, Apple, there was a small team at Apple that came up with the idea of Apple Events and Apple Script many years ago. And Apple Script on the Mac is really, there's a good argument to be made. That's the reason Apple still exists. When in the 90s, when Apple was failing, all these companies had these automations built on AppleScript for publishing workflows and whatnot. And they couldn't afford to not buy Macs because they had everything figured out already. And for whatever reason, Apple did not go that far down the stack with iPad OS and Mac and iPhone OS. We don't have the equivalent of Apple events.
Right.
So when you go over to the Mac side, you've got this amazing ability to automate anything and everything, more so than you have on iPhone and iPad. So part of me feels like, okay, we got it covered on iPhone and iPad, not with as clever of a system as shortcuts, but we've got it covered. Put your time and effort into making shortcuts better on iPhone and iPad before you move it over. But I think you're right. As time goes by, it's just got to happen. They've got to move it over.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by Pingdom. Go to pingdom.com/relayfm and start monitoring your website performance and availability today. And best of all, use offer code MPU to get 30% off. Do you have a website And does your website have a shopping cart, registration forms, or contact us pages? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then you need Pingdom. Nobody wants their critical website transactions to fail. That means a bad experience for your users and could mean lost business for you. But the good news is you can set up transaction monitoring with Pingdom. Transaction monitoring will alert you when cart checkout, forms, and login pages fail before they affect your customers and your business. Don't you want to be the first one to know when there's a problem? Pingdom will let you know the moment any of these fail in whatever way is best for you. You can customize how you're alerted and who is alerted depending on the outage severity. Pingdom cares about your users having the smoothest site experience possible, and if disaster strikes, you'll be the first to know. It's super easy to get started. Go to pingdom.com/relayfm right now for a 14-day free trial with no credit card required. When you sign up, use offer code MPU at checkout to get 30% off your first invoice. That's a huge discount for Mac Power Users listeners, and we really appreciate it. So thanks to Pingdom from SolarWinds for their support of the Mac Power Users and all of Relay FM. Once again, that's pingdom.com/relayfm with offer code MPU. So Federico, let's
Okay.
play a game. Let's pretend that Tim Cook gives you a phone call. Hey, Federico, this is Tim. I don't know. I can't do this accent. But either way, he calls you and says he loves MacStories, but he has a new job for you. He wants you to become the iPad king of Apple. He wants you to go to Cupertino, take over the iPad. So now you're the iPad king. First of all, how does it feel being king?
I think it must feel pretty nice.
Yeah, I would think so. But what are you going to do as king with the iPad?
Well, this is quite the question, really. Okay. I have some ideas.
I bet you do.
So what I think we mentioned this a few minutes ago. I think I would start from a place from a feature where you can tell that it was built years ago in a different era of the of iPad design and iPad usability. And this is a feature that actually encompasses other features. I'm talking about multitasking. So split view, slide over, and the whole system based on drag and drop and the app switcher, all those features. I think, and I would also throw multi-window to an extent into this, but primarily slide over and split view. A few minutes ago, we mentioned how every modern iPad and iPadOS feature needs to be designed while accounting for different input methods, right?
Yeah.
And I think if you look at split view and you look at slide over, you can tell that they were designed years ago, back in the days of iOS 11, where the iPad was still primarily used with touch. There was no native pointer, there was no support for trackpads, and the implementation of keyboard shortcuts in Apple's own apps was kind of spotty. Now, using multitasking on an iPad with a trackpad is awkward, right? Because the system is so reliant on drag and drop and grabbing icons from one place and dropping them to another to create windows of different sizes. There's very few UI affordances that help you along the way. And it's very awkward on a small trackpad to do these operations of grabbing icons and dropping them in an exact location on screen. I would start there and I would take a look at slide over and split view, keep what's working. I think the idea of obviously split view as an idea is necessary to the iPad, and the idea of slide over as well, like to have this, this transient panels that pop in and pop out of the screen. Like the idea itself is valid. My problem with it is the fact that it's only optimized for one mode, which is touch. And there's no keyboard or pointer equivalent of operating and managing those features.
Yeah, trying to do that with a trackpad feels like trying to defuse a bomb to me. It's like it's so easy to like overdo it, and then you get the window in the wrong place, or it's wider than you wanted, and then it's like I always just give up and use my fingers when I need to do stuff like that.
I agree. It's very surprising that this is still the way that the things are on iPad OS. And I would start there, maybe with the addition of menus, maybe with the addition of options in search, right? To maybe activate split view from there. There's a bunch of ways that I could go about it, but for sure I would start and say, how can we make it easier when you're using the pointer? And also, how can we surface these functionalities? How can we make it more obvious to people just how you can activate split view, how you can manage split view? Because right now it's very much geared toward power users, but I think a lot of average users would also benefit from split view. It's just too hidden and too hard to discover. I think it needs to be simplified,
Yeah,
and it's very tricky, right? How can you keep something powerful but also simplify it at the same time? But hey, that's why lots of people work at Apple.
exactly. And split view is not a power user feature. I mean, if you go back to the original Mac, what made it remarkable for a lot of people was the ability to manage windows with multiple apps on the screen at once. I mean, that is the original killer feature of the Mac that very, non-power users wanted. I totally agree. They
Yeah.
need to make it easier for kind of normal users to incorporate.
Also, asking another, I guess I would have many decrees. One of them would be, yeah,
Yeah, there we go.
widgets on the home screen. They need to happen. Um, yes.
Amen. Yeah.
Speaking of the home screen, I would love to do what I do on my Mac, which is I can keep files and folders on my home screen. Maybe that could be a files widget, right? It could be as simple as that, like a files widget that reopens a particular document or a particular folder. That's it.
Well, we have that though right
Well,
now.
it's only recent documents, though, right? You cannot actually
Yeah.
say load this particular document or this particular subfolder. There's no.
Or even like your favorites, the ones you've marked as favorites, you should be able to.
Yeah, exactly. You should be able to have that. Also, speaking of files, I would borrow more features from the Max Finder. So more sorting options and view options, smart folders. I'll never understand why Apple seems to be so institutionally against the idea of saved searches and smart folders or smart playlists on iOS and iPadOS. Like those are absolutely some of my
Yeah.
favorite features. Like you create your own filters and then you have these custom views that you made yourself. Whether it's in files or mail or music, this is not possible on iOS and iPadOS. And for files, I would love to have saved searches and smart folders on iPad. And I would also borrow from.
I almost was willing to give them a on that issue. I was willing to give them like a break for the first year or two that iCloud was kind of
Yeah,
taking off. That they didn't want it to break. But I feel like at this point, you're right. Why not have smart folders?
yeah. In files, I would also consider supporting quick actions with third-party extensions. So the Files app on iOS and iPadOS actually supports built-in quick actions. Like if you select a video, for example, in Files, in the inspector that you can see either in column view or by opening a menu, you will see quick actions like trim or annotate if it's like a PDF. And I would love those extensions to be user configurable. Developers could provide their own quick actions, just like they can on the Mac. If you're a developer on the Mac, you can make a custom quick action for the Finder. Or maybe an idea, maybe you could make your own quick actions with shortcuts. You could have a new extension point in shortcuts and be like, hey, this shortcut should run in the background when I run a quick action in Files. That would be pretty sweet.
Now, if you were the king, would you like accept petitions? Like if I like brought you a goat or something, could I ask for
you can
favors?
ask. You can ask.
Yeah, I would petition you to also add better tag
Yeah.
support.
Absolutely.
Files.
Better tag. Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd bring two goats.
Yeah.
if
Two
that's what
goats
it
is
took.
fine. Um, And also I would extend, right, in because file management is such like it's one of the like these are the basics of a modern computer. Um, Better integration between shortcuts and files. The fact that shortcuts is still limited to the iCloud Drive slash shortcuts folder, I think that's
Yeah, I
pretty
hate that. I
ridiculous at
hate
this
that.
point. There should be a way, maybe with bookmarks, right? Maybe it's a one-time thing that you do, like, hey, get me access to this folder, and you authorize it once, and then later you can read and write into that folder. That would be pretty lovely. I guess
I've got a whole category of Hazel scripts on my Mac that does nothing but move files out of that folder.
exactly. There you go. Also, like big picture stuff. I would redesign the app switcher to allow for. First of all, you should really be able to create split views in there by dropping a window on top of another. And like those window previews, they're so inviting to the touch, but you cannot use drag and drop on any of them. You should really be able to mix and match and combine windows in there. And also, I would love to have support for creating my favorite app pairs. I think the what's a new Microsoft folding thing called the Duo or something? I believe they have this feature
Yeah.
where you can
Yeah.
create your favorite combinations of apps, and you can save them to the home screen as an icon, and that actually shows like the two app icons together. And when you tap it, you basically recreate a split view with those two apps side by side by default. And I think something along those lines on iPad, like, hey, I always want to use, I don't know, Twitter and Safari side by side. Let me save this as I don't know, as a shortcut, as a favorite somewhere, and let me recreate that split view from just one tap. And then I guess I would love to see more pro Apple apps on iPad. I think it's time for Apple to consider stuff like, well, Final Cut and Logic come to mind. We especially
Yeah.
with both audio and video, but especially with video, we've seen how developers like the folks at LumaFusion, right, can really tap into the power of the iPad Pro. And they have built an audience of video professionals who are using LumaFusion and its many integrations to do serious professional video editing on iPad. And I think Apple is aware of this. And I don't see why Final Cut shouldn't exist on iPad Pro at this point. But really, what I want to see on iPad is Xcode. It doesn't have to be the exact same Xcode as the Mac. Maybe it's a new generation of Xcode, but something more than Swift Playgrounds. Something that lets you, maybe it's a Swift UI only thing, I don't know, but something that lets you design and write and test apps on device. So a lot of people say that a computer is only to be considered mature enough when you can write apps for the computer on the computer itself. And I think that's a pretty
Yeah.
valid threshold for maturity. And I think it's about time for iPad, for developers to be able to create software on iPad. It doesn't have to be the same thing as on the Mac. It doesn't have to have interface builder, for example, right? It doesn't have to run instruments on all the other debugging tools as Xcode. It can be a new generation of Xcode. And I think Apple should consider something like that. I think, it's been a decade of iPad. It came out in 2010, and we're now at the end of 2020. I think it's about time.
Like a Swift only version that can only make apps for
Maybe.
iPad and iPhone. But
I
yeah.
mean, if you're Apple at this point in history with almost $200 billion in the bank and God knows how many employees, you can do anything. You're only constrained by your own strategy.
Like on pro apps, the thing is, I would be a little embarrassed if I was Apple because other people are making pro apps on their platform, and Apple has pro apps that do the same thing that are not on their own platform.
Yep.
It's like, come on, guys,
Yeah.
get in this game.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I actually feel like the reign of King Federico over the iPad would be a good one. long may he reign.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I wouldn't just do, and I think it's especially important, I wouldn't just do features for power users. I think the most challenging job in software design, like big picture level, if you're somebody like Craig Federighi, for example, it's not just to come up with power user stuff, because all of us, we can
Yeah.
come up with power user features very easily. Like you give me a document and I
Yeah.
can give you a bullet list of 20 power user geeky things that I would love to have. The problem is, and the real job is, how can you make those really complex ideas and turn them into something approachable by all kinds of people who don't necessarily have the same levels of dexterity and computing knowledge and expertise as you, right? How can you democratize power in a way that becomes empowering for everyone? And that's an idea, like the idea of empowering people to use computers. That's something that I know Apple cares a lot about, cares deeply about. And it's so tricky, right? To take something complex and difficult to explain and get right to the essence of it and say, here's how you do it. You don't need the manual. You don't need to know. You don't need all these notions. It's approachable. It's user friendly. That's the real job, right? And I think we've seen over the past few years,
Yeah.
Apple absolutely get this right with things like context menus and the Magic Keyboard and the pointer and the new sidebars and the way that um, apps resize on iPad. Like that stuff they have absolutely nailed, and some other things are still kind of stuck in the past. So I'm really intrigued by what they're gonna do next in iPadOS 15, especially now that they have this new foundation for app design. I think it's time they go back to reconsider some of the ideas of iOS 11. Really, it goes back to that 2017 and the new multitasking in iOS 11. Maybe it's time to reconsider that.
Yeah. I hope they do. And that's why I'd like them to put the
Mm.
widgets on in 14 point
Mm.
something, right? Because I want get that out of the way
I
this year. Next year, look at
I
those
don't
problems.
disagree. I just think I think we're gonna have,
Yeah.
yeah,
Asking a
yeah.
lot.
Unfortunately, I'm not king, so if I were, I would listen to you. Maybe in
Yeah.
exchange for a couple more goats.
Yes. I would
Yeah,
give
there
you
you
3
go.
goats for
Okay,
that. 3
but
goats.
unfortunately, this is all hypothetical. So
All right. Well, Federico, thank you so much for giving me your time today and coming on the Mac Power Users. It's been too long, and we really appreciate every time you come on. I know you're super busy over at Mac Stories. One of the reasons why I waited was so we could give you time to get that great iOS 14 review published. We'll put that in the show notes, which is kind of the definitive review of iOS 14. If you haven't checked it out, you should go do that. Folks can find you over at Mac Stories. You've also got several podcasts. Well, just give me a list of your podcasts. I'm not sure that I've got them all in my head at the
well,
moment.
you can find me. So you can
You
find
got the
me.
one you do with John,
Yeah, well,
Mac
I do 3
Stories,
with John. I do App Stories,
App
which is the main
Stories.
one,
Yes.
and I do
Yeah.
Mac Stories Unwind, which is basically the weekend recap. And then for Club
Yeah.
Mac Stories members, we do Mac Stories Unplugged, which is like the behind the scenes stuff.
Sure.
And then you can also find me on Relay FM, on Connected, which I do with Mike and Steven, and on Adapt, which I do. It's an iPad focused podcast, which I do with Ryan. So I guess I do a bunch of shows. Yeah.
I am continually amazed at how good you are at podcasting in a foreign language. It is really
Well, the thing is,
remarkable how
thank
good
you.
you are.
But the problem is now I'm not so good at my native language anymore. I am losing my Italian abilities. No, for real. Like I am seriously struggling with things like formal phone calls, for example, just because most of the day I just talk in English, right? Either on Slack or on Skype. And I'm now facing the opposite problem, which is it's kind of funny actually. My friends yeah.
Do you think in Italian or do you think in English now?
Sometimes I catch myself thinking out loud in English when I'm alone, and I'm like,
Yeah.
how have I gotten to this point? Really? Why? But yeah, podcasting has been an amazing exercise for me. So I'm super thankful for really to Mike and Steven for asking me 7 years ago at this point to do the show, and then we went from there. So it's it's fun. I love it. It's fun to talk about this stuff.
Well, either way, everybody go over to MacStories.com to check out Federico and all the stuff he makes. Thank you to our sponsors, 1Password, Smile, Pingdom, and Microsoft, and we'll see you next week.